Welcome to the Fantasy Football Forge. My name is Steve, and today's video is going to be on either the over or under ranked running backs from the 2022 season, kind of looking forward as well as looking back simultaneously thanks to the equalized value system. I will be replaying the same introduction in the beginning of both of the running backs videos for this series, so feel free to skip ahead if you already know what's about to be said, because shortly I will be covering the entire position and how they ranked via the equalized values in tiers, and then I will start the countdown of the under/overvalued running backs, depending on which video this is. This list is determined by the difference between the EV, my equalized value, rankings compared to the rankings using the average fantasy points per week over the first 17 weeks of the season. I also did the top 48 running backs via both the average fantasy points per week score as well as via the overall score on the season, which is why we got 52 players all in all in this list. You can also find this up on the website, www.theFFforge.com. There's a link down in the description. If it's not up there yet, it will be soon enough. And sorry about that, but I'm waiting until each of the videos for each of the positions gets out before I put them up. If you're not sure exactly what you are looking at on the screen, it might be good to go to, there should be a little, card or whatever at the top right-hand corner of the screen, which would have bring you to the wide receivers, overvalued wide receivers video, which has an in-depth explanation of the equalized value system. If you don't want to just take my word for it, that explains it a little bit further. I do have this list ordered in order of the equalized value in the top to bottom, and over on the right hand side you can see what they would be ranked via the average fantasy points per week ranking, and this colored system, just one column over to the left here, also shows that and shows the actual average fantasy points per week scored. Everything's color-coded via over here, so you can pause if you wanted to look a little bit closer. That's also why I'll put this on the website, so you can look at any individual players if you wanted to. Now, this is going to be not one of the shorter videos in this series, so let's get going to cover how these players did in the 2022 season. We'll just go through them in tiers. So the first tier here, our on average RB12s across the season, are going to be Austin Eckler and Christian McCaffrey in a tier of their own. As a proud owner of Christian McCaffrey, I can say he was absolutely a tier above. He was great. And somebody in this next tier wasn't too far behind while they were healthy. This next tier starts off at the third spot here, third running back, with Derrick Henry, Josh Jacobs, Breece Hall, Saquon Barkley, Nick Chubb, and Kenneth Walker, all in there as RB18s. And if you wanted to look closer, I didn't break these apart because it just gets broken into so many tiers at this position. But over here, so 28.5 points, you could see that Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry would have really been like running back 15s if we wanted to get a little bit more technical with it, but whatever. They're all in the same close tier here. Those top 8 running backs did excellent for you. I had 1, 2, 3 of them on my team. It was helpful. But even by the time you get down to like a Kenneth Walker, as great as he was, I tell you, running backs aren't what they once were in fantasy football, but you also it's really a luxury to have the great ones, but especially if you're in like full PPR. But on to the next tier of running backs, that starts off at the RB9 according to EV, with Joe Mixon, followed by James Conner, Dalvin Cook, Ezekiel Elliott, Tony Pollard, Najee Harris, Leonard Fournette, Aaron Jones, and Ramondre Stevenson. And it looks like I did do asterisks here so you can actually see without looking too closely. All of these guys would have been more like RB21s out on a tier on their own. I just didn't change all the coloring, keep it a little bit more simplified. So that is your third tier of running backs, bringing you all the way to the 17th running back. And now we're getting into the still good running backs, but maybe not great. And yeah, I think that makes sense with this list. Started off at RB18 with DeAndre Swift, followed by Jamal Williams, Dameon Pierce, Jonathan Taylor, Sanders, Alvin Kamara, Latavius Murray, Devin Singletary, Travis Etienne Jr., David Montgomery, Cordell Patterson, Antonio Gibson. Onto the next tier here. Your RB36 is so just really inside of the flex territory. Backup RB2, Deonta Foreman, Raheem Mostert, Brian Robinson Jr., A.J. Dillon, J.K. Dobbins, Javonte Williams, Tyler Algier, Jerick McKinnon, Jeff Wilson, Rashad Penny, Zonovan Knight. Then we have In this next tier, so kind of starting to get out of useful territory, we have Khalil Herbert, Damian Harris, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Isaiah Pacheco. Then we have Michael Carter, Cam Akers, Rashad White, Samaje Perine, and James Robinson. And our final tier here, Kenyon Drake, James Cook, Kareem Hunt, guys who were probably more detrimental than not here. And I think for the most part, that's the case for most of these guys. However, some of them, they produced, both CEH and Isaiah Pacheco produced in ways where that's not totally truth. But let's move on to the whichever video this is. Actually, before we move on to whichever video this is, I do want to point out right down here are the benchmarks that I've been tracking over the last 2 seasons. So this is kind of a point of reference for the RB1. Like what was the actual RB1 over the past couple of years? On average, they would have scored you 32.5 points plus or minus about 7.5 points. So anywhere from about 25 points up to about 40 points. That whole entire range would have qualified as an RB1 type of week. 2 running backs can have RB1 weeks. Go through that explanation once again in that wide receiver video. Then here's the running back number 6 on average, 20.5 points. Number 12 on average, about 16 points. And the 18th, about 12.9 points. 24th, 10.2. You start to see the position even out here as far as the difference across positions here. Only about 2.5 points difference there. Exactly like 2 points difference from the number 24 to the number 30 running back. So around running back 18 is really where you start to get less of an advantage across others within the position. And I think we all know that once you get like 14 points, you feel like you had a pretty darn good week out of someone. And you can't be upset with their performance, at least at that point. So that makes sense. There were only 2 players that I had injuries or adjustments that I made, and those are going to be Kenneth Walker and D'Onta Foreman to make our representation more accurate of what we could expect going forward if they are the starters for their respective teams next season. We'll see in the case of D'Onta Foreman. He did perform quite well, though. And Kenneth Walker, I think we can expect him to have that starting role for sure. Now on to the 5th ranked overvalued running back from the 2022 season. This is a guy who was the 30th ranked running back via the average fantasy points per week. However, according to the equalized value, was ranked number 37, and that player is Jerick McKinnon. And don't get me wrong here, he went on one heck of a spree down the ending stretch of the season. As you can see him there near the bottom of the screen, I do have him highlighted if you want to kind of look at how he did throughout the season. But don't forget about his overall body of work come draft time for the 2023 draft. And I think even the playoffs are a warning sign to not get overexcited about how he did do down the stretch of the regular season. That may have been more of a circumstantial little run that he went on than anything. Speaking of that overall body of work, I mean, you can see it here. 6.4 points, 8.6, 2, 0.5, 8.2, 4.5, 5.8 by week, I believe, yeah, 7.4, 8.8, 0.9, 4.1. Most of the season, he had a high of about 8, under 9 points 3 times and some pretty low games. And then at the end of the season, he just went on this stretch run, which was absolutely excellent for, I'm sure, some owners out there. No doubt about that. On to the number 4 most overvalued running back from the 2022 season. This is a player who, via the average fantasy points per week, was ranked 13th. However, the equalized value puts him back at 16. And that player is Aaron Jones. He had 6 top 12 games. One was a top 1 type game there in week 2, as you can see right at the front of the season. He had 0 games outside of the top 48. So really not a bad record here. I mean, either way, he's right around near being a top 15 running back. Obviously, it's not going to look terrible. It's hard to really talk too much crap about his game, although I do know that Aaron Jones owners were frustrated with him, at least for a portion of the season. And so when you compare him to Ezekiel Elliott, Najee Harris, and Leonard Fournette, all guys that he is supposed to be better than, he had a head-to-head record of 22-20. So he did end up winning out on the head-to-head record. It's really just going to be his floor here for the most part that would be hurting him. As you can see, these 4 games that are going to hurt him against the field more so than they ended up hurting him on overall record here. I go into that a little bit more in the undervalued running back, so I'll save my breath. On to the number 3 most overvalued running back. This is a guy who, via the average fantasy points per week, was ranked 19th. However, the equalized value has him back at 23rd. And that player is Alvin Kamara. Once again highlighted right down here. And Alvin Kamara definitely had a rocky road, with 6 of his 14 games ending as top 33 weeks at best, top 48 at worst. You can see it here. Doesn't look a whole heck of a lot different than Aaron Jones's did. It's really these light blue games are what's standing out to me as being different, just a little bit higher frequency there. And so that hurt him just enough that when we compare him up against Najee Harris, DeAndre Swift, Dameon Pierce, Jonathan Taylor, all guys that he should be able to beat head-to-head more often than that, according to the average fantasy points per week, his head-to-head record was 25 wins and 31 losses, which brings on the number 2 most overvalued player from the 2022 season. Via the average fantasy points per week, he would have been ranked number 7. However, the equalized value system has him back at number 13, and that player is Tony Pollard. And so when we look at his resume here on screen, there's really only 2 weeks in these first 4 weeks here that are standing out. Remember, this is the EV number here. Those are going to be weeks that are quote-unquote top 51/54 type week and a top 63/66 week. So nothing that stands out shockingly horrible here. However, his head-to-head record, because of that, because nothing stands out to look terrible here, is actually quite surprising against this group, against Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, Joe Mixon, James Conner, Delvin Cook, Ezekiel Elliott, all guys that, all the way back to rank 15th according to the average fantasy points per week. His head-to-head record against them was 27 wins and 39 losses. Then we also have some honorable mentions here. We have CEH, Cam Akers, Deonta Foreman, and Rashad Penny. And don't forget Deonta Foreman. I did alter his output on the season to only account for all the post-McCaffrey games once McCaffrey left the team. So even with that, he still made the honorable mentions list here for an overrated player. And now on to the number 1 most overrated running back from the 2022 season, someone who, via the average fantasy points per week, was ranked 14th. However, the EV system puts him all the way back at the 22nd ranked position, and that player is Miles Sanders, once again highlighted down here. And for the top 22 players via EV, outside of the top 4 running backs, having multiple top 1 scoring weeks is rare. As you can see here, he has 3 top scoring running back 1 type weeks, and so that is very impressive. So impressive, in fact, that only 3 other guys had top 1 type weeks twice across the season, but Miles Sanders had it 3 times. However, he had 0 top 6 games, and he only had 2 top 12 type games. On the other end of the spectrum, Sanders had 5 top 39/top 42 type games. Only 3 other top 22 players had more than one of them, 2 times each, and he had, what was that, 5 of those games? So that's obviously a pretty stark difference for his floor compared to the same type of competition, even though he did have that great ceiling. To top off of his floor here, he also had a top 63/66 game. The only other 2 top 22 players in this position to have accomplished that kind of floor here were JT and Tony Pollard. They were the only other 2 to accomplish that, and JT's came on his final injury game, so that kind of barely counts. So when we look at his record going up against Ezekiel Elliott, Najee Harris, Leonard Fournette, Ramondre Stevenson, DeAndre Swift, Jamal Williams, Dameon Pierce, and Jonathan Taylor, we would see that he had a head-to-head record of 52 wins, 53 losses, and 2 ties. So not terrible. Tony Pollard by far had the worst head-to-head record given this testing, but the testing's not perfect either, and I just thought that drastic drop from being a almost top 12 guy to being outside of the top 21 for Miles Sanders was a pretty big drop to not make it in the #1 spot for the most overvalued running back from the 2022 season. Let me know what you think if you guys were owners of these players. What did you think of them? I would think news for Jerick McKinnon might have been good. Alvin Kamara, I'm going to guess overall bad. Aaron Jones, overall bad. Tony Pollard, I would be interested to see how his owners felt about him. Given the draft position, they probably felt pretty good about what they got. And Miles Sanders, I don't know. How did you feel about him throughout the season? I would think a lot of highs and lows maybe. So thank you very much. I'll catch you up on other videos. Peace out.